Welcome to How I Made It Through. I'm Bernadette Thompson, and today I have a wonderful guest. Her name is Ruschelle Khanna. She is a family business consultant and psychotherapist. She works with individuals and families to understand how inherited patterns of trauma cause us to respond with denial, leading to poor decision making and difficulties in our relationships. But as she said, there are ways to overcome these unconscious blocks. As a mediator for over 30 years, she brings deep listening and intense focus combined with practical strategy to help you and your family overcome any blind spots you may be facing. She is the author of the book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth, a guide to heal your relationships and build a lasting legacy. It is written to help you understand how inherited trauma affects us as individuals, families, and even communities, and to gain understanding of how the stories we carry from generation to generation impact our behavior. As she guides you through a process of uncovering your unique reactions to inherited trauma, all to provide the framework for helping you and your family work through those patterns and learn to establish new ones. So, Ruschelle, welcome to How I Made It Through. I'm thrilled that you are here.
Thank you, Bernadette. It is always nice to have conversations like this.
It is so true. We do know each other. We do have a colleague relationship on a project that we are both working on. But it is our deep understanding of ancestral trauma and ancestral healing and generational that has brought us together. And I would love if you would share a little bit about how you came into the space of focusing on generational trauma and as working with families and your background a little bit.
Sure. So I think I came into what I'm doing the same way maybe many people come into their chosen career, part part professional interest and part personal growth. So I've had my own experiences and ongoing experiences with ancestral healing, and I had a long career of being a therapist before I knew anything about inherited trauma. And just as my practice evolved and as I've gotten older, it went in the direction of really knowing that there are more factors in our lives than the basic things that we can control. I think people start into a therapy journey or a self-help journey with things like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
So very present centered. This is our thoughts. If we change our thoughts, we'll change our life, sort of thing. And then as you do that for a while, you realize that there are a lot of things outside of your control that
Mhm.
are coming from different places. And one of those places is our genetic and spiritual code.
Mm. It is such, thank you for explaining it that way. It was it was easy to understand because it's very true. This is this journey that we begin to take. We realize that there are other things. How did you discover or what led you to begin to work with your clients on the generational trauma part of it? Was there one thing that kind of opened you to let me start exploring this?
Yes. So I had a traumatic, but also very positive health and mental health crisis. It was also a spiritual crisis. So March 3rd of 2016, I started having seizures that lasted for 9 days. And that was a result of, later I found out I had Lyme disease, severe neuropsychiatric Lyme. So that took me out of work for several years and down a path to uncovering the roots of chronic illness, of traumatic illnesses, onset of traumatic illnesses. And that directly led me back to ancestral trauma. I did know about ACEs, and I don't know if your audience is familiar with ACEs or not, but ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, so our childhood traumas. I knew about ACEs, but I didn't really know how much they actually caused chronic health problems in adults. So I learned about that, and then that jump was then this spiritual awakening that I had during my encounter with Lyme disease opened my eyes to the fact that this was not fully my illness. I started having visions and insights related to my mother's childhood and the experiences of my grandparents that were directly related to my illness in terms of a story. I think a lot of times people ask, how are they directly related? Well, there was this narrative that I was carrying and these family stories that I had knew peripherally or directly. And I started putting these story pieces together and I thought, oh, this is why I'm having these symptoms. This is why my body is responding this way.
Mm-hmm. It is fascinating because it is often a trauma that we experience that awakens us and allows us to begin to understand the idea of ancestral trauma and things that have been passed down. And so as a professional, and as you were coming out of your own traumatic experience, both physically and spiritually, as this was this awakening was happening. How did you begin to integrate this into your everyday life, just in how you face the world, but also in how you thought about working with clients and patients?
Well, first, it opened me up to respecting other types of modalities of healing. So I did not know anything about homeopathy, and I was so sick, I would have tried anything. So one of the first things that I did when I was still ill in those years was I went to a homeopath, what they call a classical homeopath. And that woman started asking me, it was 2 days of questioning. And she was asking me questions all about my family history, things that I thought, how in the world is this relevant to me getting better? I was actually kind of annoyed. And then after she prescribed the remedy, I again didn't believe that anything was going to come out of it. And what ended up coming out of it was a series of dreams. And those dreams were about my grandfather, specifically. So I was very ill. She had asked me some questions about my grandfather's work and where he came from and what I knew of what he was like, because I didn't know him directly. And just as an example, one night after taking the remedy, I went to sleep and I woke up. I dreamed that I had coal coming out of my skin. So I was shedding coal from my skin. And when I woke up, I said, oh my God, I knew that that was my granddad's pain of being a coal miner his entire life. So it felt freeing and light, and it felt like I was healing. So that was a direct release of this story that my body had been carrying. And I viscerally knew that because I felt better after I woke up.
Yeah, it is. It's incredible the physical healing that happens when we understand this connection that we have with our ancestors, and we begin to learn not only how it affects us in our bodies, and but also what is not ours to carry. And as we learn about those stories, you begin to understand just what was passed down, but that you are separate from that. I love that story about your grandfather because I can only imagine the trauma that he went through as a coal miner.
It's so scary, and to think that you live your life in a hole in the ground, it just
Yeah.
terrifies, and people around you are dying. And
Right.
he had family who died in the coal mines. He had uncles, and there were tragedies that happened because of mine accidents and injuries. And so, it was a scary job. And knowing that on some level impacted his kids in some way, not maybe not in a direct way, that he may not have talked about how scary it was, but to come home with that experience every day is pretty heavy.
Mm-hmm. Is that did that make you want to look back at your ancestors more, like to understand more?
Yes. So that, and at the time of my illness, there was that. And then there was, I had this vision of my Uncle Joe, who had been deceased, came to visit me. Now, whether or not people believe that ancestors actually come to visit you, I believe is irrelevant. What mattered is that the story was there, that he came. And that's part of the way that I work with
Mm-hmm.
clients as well, is these things that we think we know, or these memories we think we have about our families. What's important is what you're doing with that story. And so when I started to look a little bit further, there were stories. I think this one came up in a conversation with you and I as well. I My grandfather Sicilian had a brother back in Sicily who was killed as a baby by a donkey cart.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out that story much later, but it was interesting, my reaction to recounting that story. I'd heard that story many times, but I just had a baby. And so after hearing that story again, I had a certain reaction, which was, and I think I shared this with you, maybe like embarrassment and a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
disgust almost. And I thought that was a weird reaction, because I would never, if I had heard that story and somebody else had said my baby was tragically killed, I would never think disgust and embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
But what you and our colleague Michael so nicely pointed out to me was, yeah, that's probably the feeling that your great grandmother had.
Mm-hmm.
In, like, how could she have let this happen? In humiliation, that's how someone would die in your family. That's not a dignified way to die, and all these things that I hadn't considered so viscerally. My body was carrying that rather than empathy. Most of us would just have empathy for someone if we heard that story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because it's very true. Like when those feelings that your ancestors have done a lot of ancestral work, those feelings that they experienced really come through, and you feel that yourself. For me, there's a lot of real poverty and scarcity. I came from famine families, Irish famine families, and that feeling of lack, of not deserving, of how not being able to climb out of this, and the shame that is around that as well. It came through so strongly, and even now I almost on a daily basis need to recognize that is something I have to shed, that I'm looking at a story, an echo, and not something that I'm experiencing in this moment.
And I think that's a great way to describe trauma, even inherited trauma, right? If we can see it as it's not mine. And I think that's been that's the single most powerful thing about working with ancestral healing, is that initial, oh, this isn't mine.
Mm-hmm.
This recognition that it's not mine. And that doesn't mean that we feel better instantly, but it does take off some of the pressure that I didn't do anything. I just
Mm-hmm.
came into this body. That's all I did, was came
Yeah.
into this body, and it had this stuff with it that I get to work with. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's always a bad bad thing, even the things that seem painful.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think, we're all on a journey, if we want to take it into that spiritual realm a little bit, that, we come in to just expand more, and, spiritually, and so we come in with this information almost to give us, I want to say, a platform for growth, which isn't always comfortable. It's definitely not always comfortable to go through that. And when you work with your clients, how do you begin to explain to them and what that these about these feelings?
Well, first I just start by making a space for them to start to explore the stories that they know about their family. And they don't have to have done genealogical work. They could even be adopted.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have an imagination about our parents and where we
Mm-hmm.
came from. So we just start to look at those stories, and then the process of reflecting them back and finding patterns and symbolism, almost as if it's a dream. I used to, when I first moved, I lived in New York for many years. When I first moved there, I went to these dream circles where we would get together and share our dreams. And it was a process where everyone in the circle would give feedback. They would say, if this were my dream, this is what I would think about it. So they never imposed anything on you. They just took the story and kind of gave their own interpretation. And that's one way that you can do it, is just by sharing, well, this was a story that I think I know about my mom, or a sense that I had about her. And okay, so if that were my dream, if that were my story, this is what I might think about it. And we collectively start to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you interpret, you might see patterns come out
No.
in your, oh, well, this is maybe why I interact with money this way, or this is why my relationships are struggling in this way. So it's a little bit of kind of Jungian symbol and dream interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
as well. So that's one thing.
Well, it's and I wanted to get there too, is, the patterns of behavior that, we're not the only ones who have experienced this. So, our family, our parents, our grandparents, and as we go back through the generations, all have experienced this passing down of this ancestral trauma and generational trauma. And so, as that has happened, we learned, especially generations that really didn't have any way of trying to understand it, or professionals that could help us in this way, that strong patterns of behavior get passed down, and that is part of what we're dealing with as well.
Yes. Yeah. So, usually people come to this because some rupture has happened or some problem has manifested. I mean, some people just like to look at their genealogy for recreation, but a lot of times we're trying to understand behaviors, and or make things right for our ancestors. I have several clients who have done their genealogical research because they have come from slavery.
Mhm.
And there's just a lot of reconciliation that needs to happen within their own families and within the communities that they've come from. Uh, so patterns will repeat, especially money patterns in situations like that. So, for
Mhm.
example, there'll be generations where we'll have abusive bosses.
Mhm.
And that's a common one that I see with individuals whose families experience slavery. The power dynamic is off, and that power is repeating itself. And that's definitely something that people want to break. That they don't want their kids to have to be exploited in the
Mhm.
workplace. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually fascinating, because I came from I'll just say a very, I was one of the youngest of 8 children. So I had a lot of bosses. So there, because there's a hierarchy. And that pattern that just lit up in me, that the pattern of having those types of bosses. And I finally broke the pattern in when and I can't. And it was a woman who was my boss at the time. But I finally reached okay, this needs to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just gotten so used to taking the heaviness of whatever anybody else was feeling. That idea that somebody has been wronged or feels like they've been wronged, and they pass it down to the person. And so that's a fascinating thing that we've actually never talked about that before.
Mm-hmm.
So the patterns are, also can be very tied to even things like anxiety. So, if something dramatic has happened that involves, now you talked about the coal mining, but if there are something happened, some kind of a child was lost to a drowning, like fear of water, and children can become this huge thing in a family that you don't understand, where that came from. And I know that's kind of a simple example, but there are deep feelings that get passed down.
Well, that reminds me of in families who have experienced trauma, there's this idea of self-hate or an inversion of trusting our own family. We would trust strangers more than we trust our family. We're better to strangers than we are our family. And it reminds me of my grandmother, my father's mother. She's an Italian immigrant, and she never really spoke English. She really never left the home very much. Uh, she had lost a baby. And the stories that I know about my grandmother are, that she was just a hypochondriac, and kind of belittling was the way that things were told to me about her. And then when you start to actually have empathy for, I mean, a single event of like losing a baby alone could make someone in a system where there's no mental health care, you didn't speak the language of the community, you were, in her own right, she was exploited as a woman, as a young girl, in her own experience. And you think about all these things and you think, well, why does the story of grandma have to be, oh, well, she was just a hypochondriac, she couldn't pull herself together? I mean, what is that? We
Yeah.
would never say that as if we heard that story generally or in the
Right.
media. And that's an example of that inversion or turning against the self or turning against the family that comes up if these stories are not resolved and looked at from a bigger picture, from a bigger perspective.
That again is such an important piece of this puzzle. I had a great aunt. My father's parents both died of TB when he was very young, and I had two sets of great aunts and uncles that raised he and his brother. And one, Nan, she was the oldest. There had been 5 girls, but she was the oldest, and she was just a curmudgeon. Like she was, Nan was never happy. She was, if you had to go to Nan's house, you took baths and naps. But her sister, Peg, who was the other aunt that helped raise, when you went to Peg's house, you got Hershey bars and Coca-Cola, and you played cards. So Nan had this narrative around us, around her or around the whole family, that she was just nasty and mean and just never in a good mood. And so you always wanted to stay away from Nan. When I discovered her story, and she was the oldest of 5 girls that were all orphaned, And she kept those girls together. And when her sister died, she took those boys in to care for them. And when that story emerged, I had such incredible love for what she had done and respect for the grief and trauma she had been through. And and she handled it different because Peg was the party girl who was more like, let's just do fun, kind of ignoring the situation, and where Nan carried the burden. And she kept those 5 girls together. And I found them in New York City in an apartment, all the girls. So that is a really important point about things that are not shared and how they come down.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big important things to do in this work, is to look at what people have been through with a different lens, and to step outside of the common story in the family. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, as we talk about ancestral healing and generational trauma, and how do we bring those together? It's not well known in for people who maybe do go see a therapist, or do look for some help. Uh, what is a way, how have you shared that with your clients as you have opened up to using this?
Well, I usually just start by asking about, how much do you know about your mom's experience or your dad's experience when they were growing up? And then if there's interest in that, then we can kind of go in the direction of, do you know what happened with your aunts and uncles or your grandparents? And we can kind of start to explore the whole family system uh, as a part of you. I think one of the quotes for the course that we're teaching together, I think we used, "We're only ourselves in context."
Mm-hmm.
So we are only ourselves in the context of our family. And I part of my healing journey took me into the work of family constellations.
Mm-hmm.
And family constellations is a way of visually mapping out the relationships between our family members and how we interpret that personally. And when we look at our family system as an image, and we start to play around with the images and the stories, we really realize that those images and stories are playing out inside of us, and they are shaping our world. So, it's just this huge, fascinating system that we have inside of us that's creating the lens to our reality. And it would be, in my opinion now, so foolish to ignore that system if we're trying to better ourselves in any way.
Is it hard to bring families together to do that work together? Because I see, is it uh, one person may be willing to say, okay, this is, but is it hard to kind of bring a family around so that it can start to break up, this pattern?
It is a very special family who says, "Hey, let's go to a family constellations retreat together." Or, "Hey," now I do think that, let's do genealogy work, me and mom and dad. I think people are interested in the historical, digging
Mm-hmm.
into the history, but then going a little bit deeper with, how are we interacting here with these stories? That's a special family. And that's not often who does the work. So usually individuals are doing the work, and but I always say, you can completely transform the energy body of your family if you're the only one doing the work. And so never fear. If you're the only one doing it, I've seen miraculous things happen with just one person.
Well, and I know, and everybody listening, I know, will feel the same way, that no matter how we feel, with the work that we're doing on ourselves, the moment we step back into that family, we fall into that place that we had in that family, no matter what, like it is. And the work that people would be doing with you could help them break that pattern, so that we can look at ourselves in a different light. That really hits home with me, obviously, because there were 7 other siblings that I had, along with my parents, who my dad lost his parents he was 5 and 6 years old when he lost both his parents. So there's this, just in that short amount of lineage, a couple of generations, that there's so much work that can be done, and so much that shows up of the of what's going on, and why these patterns of behavior are, surround us. I want to go back a little bit too, and talk about kind of the spiritual side of our connection with our ancestors. You brought it out when we first started talking about having the dream about your grandfather, and I want to bring up a little bit that as we begin to do this work, this energy and spiritual energy of our ancestors is around us, and is part of this healing. Could you share a little bit about what your awakening felt like in the spiritual sense?
Oh, what it felt like. I call it my Lyme awakening. So whenever I write a book about it, it will be my Lyme awakening. So I had what, maybe if anyone is familiar with Eastern philosophy, I had all of the symptoms of a Kundalini awakening. So the rising of energy from the base of the spine out the top of the head. And that's when I kind of started touching into these connections with my ancestors. And once that happened, it was very open at the beginning. So I was having a lot of insights, and I guess you could say kind of downloads about my family history. But then over the years, after I got better and I was no longer kind of in this acute state, I've had periodic interactions with my ancestors that are just so weird, oddly coincidental. And I think you doing this work, and if you hear stories of others, this is what ends up happening. So, for example, years later, I planned a vacation for my sister, her husband, and my husband at the time. I booked an Airbnb in a place called Draper, Utah. And in the meantime, I go to India, where my husband is from, and I'm love to go there and meditate, because his home, there's no windows in his bedroom. It's cave-like. I can go in there and meditate. So I'm meditating in the cave, and I get a call from my sister. It's around Thanksgiving. And she says to me, "Do you realize that we're not Erskines?" So Erskine is my maiden name. She said, "Did you know we're not Erskines?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Did you know that we're Drapers? Our grandfather is not our grandfather. Actually, a man named Mr. Draper is our actual grandfather. Did you know that?" Well, no, I didn't know that. And oddly, I just booked us a hotel in a town called Draper. So, they'll like show up in these synchronicities in these ways that is like, okay,
Yeah.
how
Right.
did that happen? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is what taking this journey really really does for us, because they are there. Many of you have heard me speak before that my ancestors came to me when my husband was very deeply in the throes of alcoholism, and he did pass away. And they came in, and it's one of those things that I had a great grandmother that actually channeled through me the rosary, and I didn't want to believe it. I didn't, you're so used to saying, no, that doesn't exist, that you want to keep saying that. But when you allow the energy, the spiritual energy of your ancestors to come in, you really can feel them. And as you said, they leave you breadcrumbs so that you know that they are there. There is no doubt in my mind that you booked that Draper because they were coming through and saying, we're going to let you know this story now. This is the real story.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because actually I was meditating specifically. I really wanted to connect with my paternal grandfather. And I was looking to kind of make another connection with him. He's the one who had been in the coal mines. And it was just a time in my life. I was like, oh, it'd be nice to hear from you again in some way. And nope, the other one wanted to pop through. And then later, I actually just recently, I was telling that story to a friend of mine in South Africa. And, in South Africa, they ancestral worship was the kind of original way that they connected with God. They didn't have gods and goddesses. They just went from their ancestors directly to the universal God. And so I was telling her, I said, I wasn't really asking for this person. And then we found out, that he was here, and not sure how great of a person this person was actually. And she said, oh, it doesn't really matter, because your maternal ancestors, however they were in this life, they're meant to be your protectors in the next life. So in other words, he didn't have a choice but to come through and help me out. My maternal grandfather. So I just found that funny and interesting.
Yeah. No, there is so much when we open up to that, and just the feeling of them coming in, and they are, our ancestors and our loved ones who have crossed over are our closest energetic connection with the other side. And so that is often why when we are having an awakening, that it does come through with our ancestors, because they're family. And when we're trying to understand this new connection, and that maybe we are connecting with spirit, we can look back and see on paper the names and who they are, and it makes a little bit more sense to us. That we have an echo of them, and because for a lot of people, this introduction into not only that ancestors can be with us, but that we do, can connect with the other side, or with loved ones who have passed, who are trying to let us know that they're okay. So it is. The ancestors play a very important role in guiding us through this life, so that we can learn from what they have been through, and then also helping us understand when we cross, or what it is when we cross.
Yeah, well, one of the last things that my dad said before he passed away was that he was talking to his sister.
Yeah.
So, that's a very common story. So in the dying process, we're very much connected to either, if you believe, our actual ancestors, or even the stories of our ancestors.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's, where it is just beginning to explore, even if you don't have the belief. I often talk about with people that I remember when I was opening up and having my experience, that sometimes it was like, I don't believe yet. It might be something that's a little too much for me to take in and say, do I really believe that? So I put it in the category of I don't believe yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you and I and Michael are Michael Hallett are joining up together to create the Ancestral Healing Center. And you actually are the one who's kind of led us in this process. And I would love it if you could share a little bit about what this is going to be for everybody.
Yeah, well, this is and I've said this to you before, this is like the most exciting thing that I'm doing right now. I'm loving this. So the Ancestral Healing Center is going to be a place where there is community and education around all things connecting to and healing through understanding ourselves in context, and that specifically in context of our lineage. And I couldn't have picked better teachers and partners. So you and Michael are, of course, the primary teachers in the course that we're developing, the first course, which will be our foundational course, and then hopefully there will be many more versions. I think we've rattled off 3 or 4 at this point that will want to. There are very specific things that ancestral healing can be helpful for: chronic illnesses, healing financial issues, those sorts of things. So we'll hopefully be branching off and looking at some more specifics. But this first round is just getting everybody up to speed with what it is to be doing ancestral healing work.
It's going to be a wonderful resource for people to go, especially when they're just trying to learn about it. What is it? And we'll have lots of videos to not only will we have the course that they can really deep dive into understanding it for themselves, but there'll be lots of little information for them to understand just a little bit about it, and a place that we can, where maybe even others can come in and be a part of this to help us open this up. It's such an important topic. And I think its time has come for people to understand how important this is for families.
Absolutely. And we will be on YouTube. So our primary location for now is a YouTube channel, and shortly a website to follow. But I'm excited to get started with the channel.
Yes, and that will be coming soon, very soon. So, well, time always flies as we are doing this. And so there are 2 things I would love to ask you. One, how could somebody reach out to you if they wanted to work with you and they needed some help? What's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So they can contact me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, or at livestyleforlegacy.com. That is my family consulting work. And then you can also find me at ruschellekhanna.com for limited, I'm still practicing therapy in a very limited capacity there.
So all of that will be included in the notes. And then, all right, what was the other thing I was going to ask you? Oh, just what would you like to share? Is there anything you would like to share just to wrap this all up?
Yeah, I think if anyone has been inspired by this and wants to get started, one of the first simple things that you can do is just to start to write down the stories that you know about your family. Whether you know if they're accurate or not, it doesn't matter, but just what are the little sayings and memories and anything that you can remember. And then once you take a look at that, just see if there's any patterns in there or anything that connects with what's happening today in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there's one other thing that we didn't quite touch on, but you will be back. But just to understand that feelings of trauma and shame and guilt and things like that will come up in all of this research. It is just a natural something that will come up. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. So just being really gentle and making sure to take care of yourself when you start looking back, because there might be some things, as my book the reason I wrote the book, Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth, is because of that denial piece. You know, we're designed to really protect ourselves from having to look at these painful stories if there are painful ones in there. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, Ruschelle, I'm so grateful that you came on and that we had a chance to share all of this. And I look forward not only to working with you as a colleague, but also just to having you back, because there's so much more that we can share.
Absolutely.
And for everybody to really look for the Ancestral Healing Center, which will be coming very soon. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And I look forward to seeing you at another episode of How I Made It Through.
Awesome. Thank you.